Welcome to another episode of Money for Nothing, the podcast about music and capitalism. I'm Saxon buried with Sam Becker as always. And today we are going to follow up on something that we said we would follow up with well over a year ago, I guess now. And that is the...
almost 2.
Yeah, almost 2 years. And that is the Astroworld Travis Scott concert tragedy. The full police report came out recently. It's over nearly 1,300 pages, and so we're going to dive into that and kind of do a little follow-up. But before we dive into this very serious episode, Sam, did you know that the tablature site to learn, like, you know, you want to learn like guitar riff or whatever, you know, it's like ultimate guitar tabs or something, that if you want to go ahead and learn the most popular song in the United States this year, which is Morgan Wallen's Last Night. It I think pretty by far is like the number one hit this year. You can't learn it. His label has. I mean,
you could learn it by listening to it.
You can learn it by listening to it, but if you're maybe like, you know, don't have the ear for that, his label has actually like pulled the guitar tab down from this site out of copyright concerns, which I can't even begin to understand the logic behind that. Is this like an AI thing? Like, what the fuck?
It's because you don't want the kids playing the song, right? Every time someone with an acoustic guitar plays Wonderwall instead of streaming Wonderwall, that is fractions of a cent that Oasis's label is not getting. Think about that. Think about that next time you steal from the Gallagher brothers by playing Wonderwall.
Yeah, truly. So is it that? Or do you think it's like AI or like, no way? I mean, like,
I think it's probably that. I mean, the question would be, is there a broader takedown? Because there's an argument from a record label.
Because I've never seen it. Yeah.
If you are selling advertisement against our IP, tabs.com or whatever, no, like if you on like saxonbaird.biz put up your personal homemade tabs, like they probably wouldn't come after you, is my gut. But like some of these tab sites are like pretty big and are centralized warehouses for users to upload unlicensed versions of existing and policed IP, and those sites are making money off it. And if you're a major publisher, you might be like,
how dare you?
Like, we want
30%
we want 30%
of that.
I mean,
yeah, 30% of that.
We want 30% of the tab money.
The question is the guy who wrote the fucking song, is he getting any tab money from it? Probably not, if that happened. Anyways, we can go down this road quite far, but I noticed that recently, and I thought that was
texting me angrily from Berlin about your inability to look at country music tabs. Yeah. It's real, guys.
Last time we're not. All right. Anyways, so back to the topic.
Would you say that you can't do that in a large German city? Don't try that. Don't try that in a large German city. That was a Jason Aldean joke, Saxon.
Oh yeah. Yes, right, because of the new track. Yes.
Yeah,
see, this is I'm halfway across the world now, and
you're not in touch with the common people anymore.
I know. Should we just talk about country music? Yeah. But
so anyway,
this is a really difficult sort of transition here. But no, I just wanted to.
Well, it's tough because it's a tough subject to talk about. Like, I went through 950 pages of that 1,200 page police report, and it's really grim. A lot of it is really tough reading. It's a lot of scared people describing situations that nearly killed them. It's a lot of really frustrated and angry EMTs, like, struggling to understand what was happening. It's like, I think we're joking around a little bit, because it's like there's no way to sugarcoat that this was like a really grim, sad incident, and you know, one of a string of like, and we'll talk about this a little bit, like surprisingly rare, truly horrifying crowd incidents in the U.S.
So on November 5th, 2021 in Houston, Texas, Travis Scott's Astroworld, which was like kind of like 2-day concert and featured a number of big names. The first night of the concert at Energy Park, Scott took the stage around 9 p.m. and basically about 30 minutes later, there was what's called like a mass casualty event, which basically there was a crowd push and kind of a stampede. 10 people died, including like a 10-year-old boy, and like thousands of people were like documented in this police report as being injured. And we covered it at the time because, yeah, as you said, it was like such a rare and horrific event.
Horrific event.
But we also were like a little unhappy with and maybe confused with the sort of narrative that was happening around the event, which we can dive into in a minute. But basically, nearly 2 years later, strangely around the same time as Travis Scott's new album coming out, the entire police report of the incident has come out, and basically it's
along with the decision to not press charges against Scott, Live Nation. That there were at least no criminal charges were filed after this lengthy investigation.
Yeah, the attorney said that the grand jury found no crime occurred, and that no single individual was criminally responsible for this tragic event.
A wide variety of civil cases are still ongoing.
Right,
like
yes,
a large number of them. Some of the most prominent of which has been, especially the people who are deceased, have been settled out of court, often for like unknown six figures. But yeah, there's a lot of litigation around this that's ongoing. But certainly from like a criminal perspective, it seems to have wrapped.
Yeah, and at the time of the event, there was a lot of like finger pointing going on, and particularly at Travis Scott himself. There was like footage of like a fan trying to stop the concert. Scott claims he didn't like see him. He didn't really know what was going on. He said he only learned about the deaths like after the concert. In the police report, there was some sound engineers that said that they overheard Scott's auto-tune guy say something in his ear about how like conflicting reports, but that like he said that like there was a couple deaths, or there was like bodies hitting the floor, or like things like that. And basically like the report has come out to say that like that nobody was really specifically responsible. But at the time, like I think before we dive into that more into the report, I think we should maybe just give a little background about like kind of what was the narrative that was like going on and how it was reported when this event happened, and then we can go ahead and kind of like put that up against like what actually came out in the police report.
Yeah, I mean, I think we were upset because at the time it was very much this like anti-rap narrative. It was that like Scott was this uniquely reckless, dangerous performer, that the kind of music that he was performing was somehow uniquely violent or had like a real connection between this event, this horrifying tragic event, and the kind of music Scott was performing. Specifically this kind of like mosh pit adjacent style of like trap. Like this like, Scott talks about raging, and he encourages these like super intense mosh pits and super intense crowd engagement. And there was a sense that somehow like that was what he was responsible, and that style of music was responsible. And we were kind of just given the history, and not like ancient past history, like recent and continued ongoing history of police pressure on promoters and societal pressure on promoters to crack down on live rap music, and specifically like music performed by Black Americans. We were just like very aware and concerned that Scott would get scapegoated, and that regardless of what happened, like this would be used as kind of a cudgel against a wider, like an entire musical genre that often struggles, in New York certainly, like struggles to find places to put on live shows because of concerns about violence, which can mean any number of things. And we were kind of like there's major multi-billion-dollar companies involved in this. Like, that Scott is not like setting up it's not a DIY show. He's not setting up the barricades the night before. It's like all of this is contracted out,
or designing like how the crowds like switch from one stage to the next, or
exactly.
Like anything.
And we were like, this seems like scapegoating Travis Scott and not being concerned about Live Nation's involvement seemed ridiculous to us.
Yeah, completely ridiculous. And we didn't, obviously we were like a little bit like, well, let's see what happens when the police report comes out. But from what we had heard, it was like a lot of like third parties were hired by Live Nation, including like security teams that weren't like, who were like later being interviewed said that they were like inadequately trained, like almost like found out what's going on like the day of. And yeah, we're like, there's a multi-billion-dollar company behind this whose sole job it is to put on concerts and make them safe for people to go to those fucking concerts. Why are we blaming Travis Scott?
And in fact, we know why we're blaming Travis Scott. We're blaming Travis Scott because like he's a black dude and he makes aggressive music. And so like that's who America's gonna blame, folks. Like that doesn't take a take a PhD in anything to figure that out.
And I think for us it was like really surprising like where this blame was coming from, because it would be easy to assume that this blame would just be coming from like more conservative circles in this country, but actually like it wasn't. It was kind of coming from like almost kind of like a lot of different range of people that was kind of surprising. And yeah, I think it's that reason. And I also think it's like people want to put blame on someone, and also like he's like the head of the concert, he's the star, and so they want to put the blame on the star as well. But of course, yes, being a young black man who makes aggressive music is just like adding to that for sure. And we're sitting there like, yo, hold on a minute, back the fuck up. There's other things going on here, and like we didn't have all the details, but now we have pretty much all the details.
Yeah, a lot more of the details. Though, like, which details we get, which details we don't get, and
it's interesting.
Is super interesting. And when we got them is super interesting. So for one, there was a gag rule on pretty much everyone involved in this reports until just recently, which means that for the year and 3/4, in which all this was being investigated and being played out in, I guess, a grand jury, like, no one could talk to the press. And the way the gag order was worded, my understanding, again, like, we're not lawyers, folks, but my understanding of the way the gag order was worded was that it was pretty vague. So a lot of people weren't sure if it applied to them or not. And in that situation, it's safer to stay quiet. And so part of the total absence of follow-up reporting on this, when things were still fresh, when people were still angry, has been, but at least partially due to that, in a way that I think really shaped the narrative around all of this. I mean, this story is reemerging in the news now, but I wonder if there had been like a constant trickle of new information and discussion when it was more in the public memory still. This is now something that happened a chunk of time ago. Like, all kinds of stuff have happened in between now and then, whether that would have changed things. It's also like, and again, this was just kind of interesting, is I've looked at a lot of different kinds of evidence before in kind of like my journalistic and scholarly careers, but I've never read through a full-scale police report like this, where it's just like, it's 120, it's 12,000 pages, of which like 600 pages are just
1,200.
Sorry. 1,200 pages. 1,200 pages, of which like 600 to 700 of them are just like every single police officer who was there who didn't see anyone has like all of their information and their like work hours, and like there's a lot of like funny redundant information in here. But also you get a sense for like how investigations actually work. Like, the Houston PD does not have like a music industry guy. They have some like detective who doesn't know how the music industry works, and he starts like figuring out, and he has like informational interviews with people who weren't there, who try to explain to him like how like mic and board setups work, and he's talking to all kinds of different people. And again, this is like not crazy. Like, news to anyone, but the investigators had easy access to at like a basic fact finding level, and who was most closely related to Live Nation, like those are related. Those trend lines are related in that everyone who was Live Nation lawyered up day of, had corporate lawyers. The cops couldn't get anyone without a lawyer present. Most of the interactions with a wide variety of Live Nation employees went through their lawyers, and the lawyers kind of like made enough friction so that instead of pushing for interviews with everyone, which is clearly like what you'd like to do, they just pushed for interviews with like the most important people, and then had the other Live Nation people kind of give answer a questionnaire, which definitely makes it harder to engage, like figure out what was going on that corporate side. And not necessarily because just because like fewer conversations means there's fewer chances for someone to say something interesting that then leads to another person, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But because it was lawyers and they have a limited amount of resources, they like got the big people to talk to them. Again, with lawyers in the room. Again, the lawyers wouldn't agree to have it taped. So these are officer notes of these interviews, but not direct transcript tapes for a lot of them, which again is because, yes, you could probably force them to have it, but if the lawyers are fighting with you, they make everything more difficult the whole way. And you do get a sense of just the ways in which people with power and money can shape investigations just around their desires and demands without it ever falling outside the letter of the law. Which again, this is not a particularly this is not unique to this investigation, and is not maybe a particularly insightful point, but it was fascinating to see it played out like page after page after page after page.
Well, I think it's just contextual. You're just trying to contextualize like what we're about to dive into, in the sense that like, you know, this is like an extensive report on what happened, but there's still like obviously questions that will probably never get answered.
Yeah, no, there's a lot of questions, I would say, that come out of this report.
But like, let's go before we dive into that kind of thing. Like, before we dive into some of that, like, why don't we go ahead and first like kind of bulletin point maybe a few major points that came out of this report.
Sure. So for one, and this is very weird to say in something that's so clearly like a tragic event, and is really, I think, the biggest headline that like this report doesn't answer, which is that at some level, everything went according to plan. No barriers failed, which means there wasn't a huge push of people into an area they weren't supposed to go into. Nothing shut down at the wrong time. Right. While maybe security wasn't the best, like there weren't reports of security guards being totally overwhelmed in places. While maybe the EMTs didn't have like, and the multiple EMT services that were all working together weren't perfect. It wasn't like there was a total breakdown and people couldn't interact. Like it didn't work very well, but like at some level, everything went according to plan, which raises the question of, if everything went according to plan, how in God's name did something this terrible happen? And that's, I think, like the dog that didn't bark throughout this entire, and we'll get into this more, but there's this kind of like, there was no one point of catastrophic failure that led to this.
Yeah, I think like, when the crush started to happen, it also, like, I think you made the good point, there wasn't this like massive crowd charge. Like for the most part, like it was a slow crush that happened over a half an hour, and the crowd like basically did what a crowd does. It wasn't like a panic where everybody starts running towards the same exit or something and people are getting trampled. It was like, no, it was this very slow development over like, you know, half of an hour.
Which is not how it was reported at the time at all, and is like very different than how I think people, even in the media, are discussing this, right? Like this wasn't a stampede. This wasn't everyone running towards the front of the stage. In fact, like if you read reports, there's one area of the crowd, for reasons that like still seem really opaque. That when a whole bunch of people had been there and a new group of people came because SZA's set ended, came in to see Travis Scott, which was the only show happening, when the entire group of people who were supposed to be attending this headlining performance were actually there attending this headlining performance. The density in a certain part of the crowd just got too much, and people started falling over, and once people start falling over, other people fall over on top of them. And like, actually, like, reading the reports, it could have been a whole lot worse. Like, people, again, this is like skin crawling, like people describing 3 layers of bodies falling on top of them, and everyone's just so packed in and no one can get out. It's just like, for anyone who has even a hint of claustrophobia, like, do not read this report. And yeah, so that was this crush, like you're saying, that happened over like a relatively long amount of time, in kind of like predictable, maybe not predictable ways, but like unidirectional ways. It just kept crushing and crushing and crushing.
Which also like is an argument against the narrative that was being reported about this sort of like satanic panic over like the craziness of Travis Scott shows, and they're just out of control and so wild. And it's like, actually, this report, like, it wasn't this like thousands and thousands of people moshing or like trying to climb on top of each other and jumping off stage. It was none of that, actually. You know, it was like, this is what this is suggesting, that it was, the crush happened over a short amount of time. So that kind of like negates this sort of way in which it was originally reported.
And not just like how it was originally reported. And I think that that's something that is worth considering more in terms of like blame here. Which is it's not just how it was reported, it's how everyone was set up to deal with the situation. This is one of the clearest things that you get through this like catalog of errors that is this police report, which is that everyone was worried about like kids wilding out. They were worried about gate crashers. They had a lot of cops looking for gate crashers, right? They were worried they were going to knock over barriers. They were worried that the kids were going to like riot and destroy things. When people started coming in, everyone was worried about fentanyl, right? There's this like very like total apocryphal, like classic boomer apocryphal story.
Oh yeah, I remember this.
Of that is like goes through this police report until eventually it like comes out that no one actually saw this guy, and it never seemed to happen, which is that one of the security guards got like jabbed in the neck by someone with like a needle of fentanyl and like OD'd and had to be taken to the ER tent and revived. And so like that's in the back of everyone's mind when these crowd crushes come in, and they're really worried about them being ODing on fentanyl and like drugs and violence. And as far as I could tell, no one actually treated that guy because he didn't exist. Like, it didn't happen. But everyone, day of, there's like rumors going around the staff of like this happening, this guy, because like the kids are so crazy that they're like jabbing people with like murdering people, I guess. Like, it's like the knockout game, but like with a needle of fentanyl. Like, what?
Totally insane. Like right, totally insane.
What? But I feel like it's indicative of the general mindset of this
fake news.
No, the general mindset about like kids, right? About young people, about this kind of music, about this sense of like that this wasn't a normal crowd. This was like this set of unruly, like, wild, like raging teenagers who like, or young people
don't have
or,
good
like,
parents, latchkey kids,
or who, like every
rap music,
exactly, like every stereotype you could imagine, and like
it's been going on for like what, like fucking 70 years now.
And so as a result, right, like because of this, the focus is on a type of violence and a type of disruption that just doesn't happen at all. And instead, like these kids, young people who get killed are all like, didn't do drugs, like didn't smoke cigarettes. Like, they're with friends from school, but not their boyfriends because they didn't have them yet. Like, these are just like these good, like, the definition of like these good kids who wanted to see the musician they liked. And if you look at that, a huge crowd of people, like, there's this, like, you know, sickening distrust of everyone else that I just think is so corrosive. Like, if you look at a big group of like 15 to 23-year-olds, they like are pretty much all exactly like you were at the age of 15 to 23. Like, yes, maybe they're more likely to jump on a crane because like their frontal lobes are not fully developed. But besides that, like, most of them are just like there to like hang out with their friends and see an artist that like appeals to them emotionally and let off some steam. And so, yeah, there have been some like gate crashing incidents at and like mosh pit incidents at Travis Scott shows previously. And I think there is like a question, like an interesting question maybe, about the complexities of like cultural practices in the internet age, right? That like mosh pits and moshing develop in like a hardcore and metal scenes that have like, while it's violence, it's like very controlled violence that have like really specific, that have developed when these like slam dancing was like first really emerges in the 80s, like hardcore punk, which then introduced it to metal. Like, there was a period of in early 80s hardcore when it was too violent, and then it like made it impossible to have shows, and then the scene figured it out and dealt with it, right? So like, actually, like, you can go into a huge circle pit at a really big show, and like, yeah, you might get like punched in the face mostly by accident, but no one's gonna stomp you out. And there is, I think, a sense of like, there is some worry that like in these reports, people were falling down and no one was picking them up. Like, certain kinds of like rules of engagement just didn't make the jump.
Yeah. Actually, I mean, there's a little bit, you're kind of going off a little bit on this sort of other track here, but like I do think it's an interesting point that does relate in the sense that like about the sort of internet culture of it and its contribution in a contemporary society. Because I actually was with a couple like younger guys that like I was at a bar where they were like showing me videos of like some pretty major like metal bands and hardcore bands and the shows. And that it was like professionally shot, but it was like the mosh pit was like extremely violent. At one point, like there was actually like I think an Australian band, I can't remember their name, but like the lead singer was actually just going and like punching guys in the fucking face, like along the rail. And I was like, this isn't the mosh pit that I grew up in, you know? And it's like, and I think it's like, I wasn't even thinking at the time, I was thinking like, oh, this is probably like, you saw footage online, you want to reenact that because it looks wild and crazy, but like these kind of rules of engagement in a concert as like a concert, like maybe slightly violent and chaotic, but also a safe space, or you're trying to create a somewhat of a safe space or some sort of like order within the chaos, like isn't really there because there isn't the, I mean, if you really want to go far, because there isn't like the fucking community anymore, because we live in a more atomized, individualistic society where we're all online. So we're all getting together and doing this in a basement, and then the band gets big and moves to the bigger concert venue, and like we're all kind of discussing this as a group of people. We're all kind of coming in at once from the videos we saw of like a crazy Slayer show in like 19 whatever, and like thinking that and just reenacting it without these kind of rules, which is it's an interesting point. That's an interesting point. But I think that like going back to the police report, in the sense that there is that, but like that's not like a major contributor of like why this happened. And rather what's a major contributor to why it happened is that like there was kind of just like a disconnect between who the fuck was in charge. There's like Travis Scott on stage, there's Live Nation, there's the security forces, which are third party hired by Live Nation, and then there's the fucking police. And there just wasn't, from what I can tell from reading it and the information, there just wasn't really any kind of like good information going back and forth between these four groups that were supposedly all together, supposed to secure and make the concert safe and also make the concert run.
Yeah, and I think that was like the very distressing. The judge, when the decision to not charge anyone came out, the judge was like very clear that it's like no one person was criminally liable, and like, yeah. Sure, but yeah, the more you dig into this, the more you realize that just this is, in some ways, it's about a system that kind of, when pushed, while it worked on paper, when things started to go wrong, didn't have the ability to react, to deal with it at pretty much any level. And
I think, yeah, if we like break down like each of these groups like a little bit, like you could see like how the disconnect and the sort of gray areas that also kind of exist in the report.
one of the most interesting parts of the police report was this long interview they did with this gentleman who had previously worked with Travis Scott and was a long time. He was like his late 30s. He'd been doing it for like 15 years, something, in probably long time, and had been working in the concert promotion industry, and just was this like really forthright informational interview, because he was not involved in the concert at any level, so he was just able to talk about what should have happened. And one of the things that he said is that when I run tours or events, when I run tours, we have a crew before the event starts, and that's our crew the entire tour.
100%.
Because then everyone knows each other, and everyone has a sense of who to call. And even if it's not like a direct, you're not supposed to talk to this person, like, George from the lunch line. And so, like, you have his cell number and you can, like, text him. And that, I mean, a lot of this police report is just like tragic reports of people technically involved in the production, specifically people involved filming who were out in the crowd, realizing that shit was going wrong. And there were no way for them to connect to what was actually happening. So it
seems like there was never like the meeting beforehand, like, hey, if shit goes down, like, this is who you walkie-talkie, or like, this is who you radio, or whatever. And I think that, like, it's interesting because I don't know where you want, like, I think it might be worthwhile at this point to sort of like look at kind of what the report said about Scott being on stage, and then also look at kind of like what like Live Nation involved with like the security forces might be interesting, and then we can kind of move over into something we haven't talked about, which is really interesting, which maybe we'll talk about with Scott, which is Apple's role in it, and this big bag of money that was at the end of the concert. But I think that maybe just to start, like we mentioned this at the top of the show, and I think we mentioned this the last show, but it's also the sort of lack of preparation. There was interviews with the security forces saying that they like were really untrained, and that they were actually third party security teams that were like hired by Live Nation. So like Live Nation chose to basically cut corners, spend less money, and like hire like a local like security team for this, who felt like they were not ready for it. Basically, they were undertrained.
Yeah.
And then I guess there's also now like and I think we should like address this head on, is that there was footage of like a fan or fans trying to stop Scott on stage, which was like a big like in the satanic panic of like at the aftermath of this show, and people wanting to point fingers, they were like blaming Scott. Now this is the interesting part, I think, for interesting part of this police report, was that like they tried to break down like how much did Scott actually know, and could he have actually like stopped the concert. And I mean, the conclusion I think is not necessarily fully clear, but because there's a bit of conflicting reports. But essentially, the overarching point we're making about how there's just like wasn't enough preparation, there wasn't a lot of like communication between the teams, is that like the person who was in direct contact in Travis Scott's earpiece was his fucking auto-tune guy.
Yeah.
So like technically it's like the auto-tune guy is the one who's supposed to make the call or something. Like that doesn't, and there are reports of like him telling Scott that there was like shit going on in the crowd. And I mean, Scott did actually like at one point say something like, hey, we all good out there, like and he had seen an ambulance, and he was like, hey, make room for it. So it's not like he was like complete, and he was like, but he I think the one thing we can say, the takeaway, is he didn't actually really, even if he did know that some shit was going on, he didn't know like the extent of it that was going on.
Yeah. So, okay. So there's a lot there, right? It's I think, yeah. So basically, it's useful to think about from what I can reconstruct of this kind of the corporate structure of this. Technically, this is a Live Nation event. It's actually owned by Live Nation subsidiary called Score More Entertainment, which is just like another concert promoter. They hired Seth Boardman, who ran a risk management company that did a lot of the logistics and organizing and security, which then it seems like hired other security companies to fill out the ranks. In addition, you had a chief of like a huge, one of the higher ups in like both Houston Fire Department and Houston Police there, but they were off. They were not in the central decision making area. They're kind of off-site providing support, but technically have like operational authority over the entire thing. Then you have Scott, who's on stage, Scott's managers, a whole bunch of people working for Apple, and then Bilal Joseph, aka Busy, who is Scott's auto-tune guy and the only person who had direct access to Scott during the performance. And all of these different groups are making decisions about what's going down as you start getting reports of this crowd crush. And none of them have really the clearance or the leverage exactly necessary to make the call to shut things down, which
it's a lack of chain of command.
It's a total lack of chain of command, right? So you have eventually the security, the people running the event basically going at right around 10, which is in some ways already too late. This show started around 9:10. You start getting real reports of people getting hurt within 10 to 15 minutes. That like really lethal half hours in there. I think Drake goes on at and Drake is another part of this because they don't want to cut the show before Drake gets on, and he hasn't gotten on stage yet. So there's this, and there's seems like a $4.5 million Apple contract to live.
Yeah, that's the thing that we were gonna mention. Yeah. That apparently Apple came into this to like live stream it last minute, and according to the report, there was 5 stipulations in order for Scott to fulfill in order to make the 4.5 million. And they don't talk about what the other stipulations are, but one of the stipulations is that he needed to finish the concert because it was being live streamed on Apple, and that would be a reason why that would be one of the stipulations he needed to fulfill in order to get the 4.5 million.
Which I don't think, and I'm not sitting here being like, and Travis Scott didn't stop performing because of this money, but I think that the sense that they really didn't want to stop the show in an abrupt way added additional friction at every level of this chain of command. And so then you have things where the people who are basically running the production are like, it needs to be done by 10. We need to get these people out of here. And then the police chief who's there, who they ask, someone in Scott's production team asks, can we get 10 more minutes? The police chief says yes. The police chief, not knowing the full extent, because his officers are on the exterior of the crowd and aren't doing the security, pulling people out of this crushes inside of the crowd, says yes, you can have 10 more minutes. But then the people actually running the event have no authority over the police chief, who is has, is the Houston, high up in the Houston Police Department, and is the highest ranked person on site. And so, so it's this complete and total gray area clusterfuck that in some ways replicates the corporate structure of so much of America, right?
Yeah, fuck, dude, that's a great point.
You have just people, subcontractors of subcontractors of subcontractors, and then the whole system can do a thing and no one is exactly doing it. And so basically a decision was made, more or less, to not cut the show really early at the first sign of trouble. But someone made that decision, but at some level, no one made that decision.
Yeah, and it's also just, I think in the end, it's just like if you're thinking what we're thinking, dear listener, it's fucking crazy that you would have such a big fucking event like this. And there's like, I mean, a clear lack of preparation. I mean,
Terrifying.
It's pretty standard. I've worked actually major concerts as a bartender. I've like been to major concerts as like, I've done like live broadcasting like at major concerts. And I mean, like, even coming in as a sort of like outsider to these concerts, there's like hey, if you need an emergency, this is the person to call. Or like if you need something, like talk to this person and they know who to talk to. So it's just fucking, the whole thing is just like fucking totally, total fucking breakdown. And like, something that, resulted in unfortunately, like people's lives being taken. And the thing is like, what can we get out of this? And like, hopefully it'll never happen again. And I don't know, like in a weird way, like, the fact that like no one was like at fault or like no company was at fault, and it is kind of like
that's the ball game.
Like, that's the ball game. Yeah, totally. Yeah.
No, I totally agree. It's like it's scary, right? Like the idea that at some level there were 50,000 people here and no one was running it.
Fucking crazy.
And some of these things were like, again, even at the very last, like the some of the worry about leaving was worry about I think wildness, right? So they've got special egress gates. You want to have a lot more gates letting people out of a concert than you do letting them in, and so They needed time to set those up. And if they had cut it early, they were worried they wouldn't be set up in time to let people out in a safe way. And so they kept them, right? Like decisions like that where, like, again, I'm not a civic engineer, but like surely there's a way to deal with that.
But you've been to enough concerts and like baseball games and sporting events to like see it work perfectly with just as many people, if not more. You just went to the like last shows of Dead and Co. at City Field. Like, it's like these things, that's people can do this.
That's another part of all of this, right? That's, I think, a little bit complicated, which is this wasn't held at a stadium. This was held in a parking lot, a huge parking lot that they'd set up a temporary structure for. And my sense is that at least some of this is that for certain kinds of like live performances from younger folks, like it's harder to get that booked in a stadium because of concerns about, and it's this kind of gestured towards subtly at various points in the report that like they're having to put shows on in places like this these days where like, this wouldn't have happened in a baseball stadium where there are like clear entrances and exits, and like you wouldn't have had to worry that like you needed to set up the exits because the exits are already there.
I mean, I agree with all that, but I think going back to my point is that the fact that no one was really held responsible in the end means that like no one needs to change the way in which they're operating.
Yeah.
And like obviously I'm sure Live Nation has probably had some sort of internal discussions and maybe structural changes around this, but they could still hire a third party. There's probably not I don't know for sure, but there's probably not like the checks and balances involved in like making sure that like this doesn't happen again. And I think for Scott's side, I think actually like, he has slowly but surely been playing more live shows. And I think it's important to note that at a recent show in Coney Island, there was like some fans who were like climbing up a scaffolding, and in like one of his biggest songs, he actually stopped the song and made sure that they would get down for safety reasons. So, I mean, like Scott's obviously like learned his lesson from this as well. And like, hopefully his team is like now like considering this with each show. But I think, when it comes to Live Nation, it's like in the end, like they really don't have to fucking change anything. They can still do the same fucking shit. They can still hold concerts in parking lots, hire third-party fucking security guards, not train them. Like the same thing could happen again.
And like, you kind of feel like what you also need is just like, because at some level, again, like like security guards maybe like didn't help as much as they should have, and they weren't able to like break into these areas. There may have been some changes to like the basic kind of corralling of the people with fences that like made larger areas rather than smaller areas. There's also just like, it seems like an engineering question, right? Like this was able, bridges are designed to hold like some level of load more than they would ever reasonably have to take. They build redundancy into this system, right? This was a system with no redundancy, right? There wasn't extra space in case something like this happened, clearly, because otherwise it couldn't have happened, right? If you build it so that there's 3 times as much space and that's mandated by law, this wouldn't happen. Clearly, like, there was a major error, and the report frustratingly doesn't get to it. There's a major error in, like, at some level, like, the way these grounds were laid out. If nothing catastrophic happened, if there wasn't a stampede, if this is like SZA stopped playing and all of SZA's crowds came over and there was like a natural crush point, like that's an error of engineering and an error of redundancy. It seems like that there wasn't enough space for this crowd.
Yeah, which would seem like a basic aspect of when you're designing a concert and you know how many tickets, or you can estimate of how many tickets are going to sell.
Right before we move on a little bit, just in terms of like Scott and stopping shows that you mentioned earlier, it was really interesting in some of the discussion again, like because there's and that it's so clear from this report that like we'll never know, you know what I mean, like how much he knew that things were wild in the crowd. Clearly, I would say that he thought that one person being seriously injured wasn't enough to stop a single incident in which someone was seriously injured. Seems like it probably wasn't enough to stop the full show because he's used to people getting injured at his shows. He did stop several times, like you said, just in terms of personal culpability. But also, it's interesting. They interviewed him, and he like has these very specific techniques for like checking to make sure people are okay in the crowd. So he'll do crowd response stuff. He'll be like, everyone throw up your middle fingers. And if in part of the crowd they're not throwing up their middle fingers, he knows that something's wrong there. Or he's like, everyone wave their cell phones. And if there's a chunk that's not waving cell phones, he's like, guys, over there, like something's going on. They're not engaging. He's this amazing line, like, when they don't do what I tell them to do, I know there's a problem.
Yeah, I mean, like, that's fucking smart. I mean, that's actually really fucking smart. Yeah, I know. I thought the checks, the sort of the like health check-in with the middle fingers being thrown up was I appreciated that. That was good. That was good. I think moving on to finish up the episode, I think there's something we kind of want to go ahead and like also talk about, is that outside of this police report and this horrific tragedy, there's like a long shadow that's kind of hanging over it involving Live Nation, and the fact that Live Nation is and has been actually currently under investigation for antitrust by the Department of Justice.
Yeah.
And since this tragedy in the last couple of years, it's actually been going on. I guess they've actually been under investigation since like 2010. Actually, I mean, the background that I understood is that there was concerns by the government around antitrust stuff with their merger with Ticketmaster. They were required to like sell off a part of Ticketmaster in order to allow the merger. They didn't follow that. The government has reinvestigated, and it's like this whole antitrust lawsuit that's really sort of accelerating right now. Anyway, so that holds like this like interesting but also very important like aspect that kind of relates on a sort of like macro level that kind of hangs a shadow over this tragedy. And I think we just kind of want to like dive into that a little bit and parse that out a little bit as well.
Yeah. I mean, it does. And in some ways, given all that, this was a huge win for Ticketmaster. And in some ways, Ticketmaster's like ability to create levels of plausible deniability, right? Like, so the headline coming from this was not Ticketmaster on the ropes from failing, Ticketmaster Live Nation, on the ropes from failing legions of Swifties, found guilty, criminally liable
Responsible, yeah.
criminally responsible for Astroworld tragedy. Like, so that would have been really bad. But I do think that there's this increasing, and in the background for this, like you said, is this increasing concern about the level of centralization and monopolization in the concert touring industry as that industry becomes an ever bigger part of the like musical and cultural and economic pie. And like, yeah, it does seem like this is likely. I mean, like, in addition to not being normal lawyers, we're also not antitrust lawyers, but Ticketmaster's massive shadow over live ticketing, which we've talked about a fair bit, and like the ways in which that plays into their ability to also be the dominant figure in concert promotion, which is Live Nation, which, you know, organizes touring. Once you get like the reason that merger was designed was because putting both of those but that vertically integrating was helpful. And yeah, it is. It's also the sign of a monopoly when you control a majority of two different markets in which control of one helps you assert dominance over the other and it pushes people to work with Live Nation, who, because of Ticketmaster's dominance and vice versa. I mean, we've also talked a fair bit about like what breaking this up would even do. And like maybe I think in the context of this discussion we've had so far, like sheds a little bit of new light on the potential stakes of that, right? That, you know, we've kind of said previously, I think, and I think I'll go to the mat for this, that Ticketmaster's, whether or not you like Live Nation / Ticketmaster, I don't think high ticket prices are their fault. That they're the fault. There's a ton of people who want to see these shows, and they're willing to pay a lot of money for it, and that's sort of on the culture a little bit, and on people's demand for this stuff, and arguably like some of these shows are underpriced because of like the waning dregs of like a populist vision of mass consumption. So like there has been, I think we've previously been somewhat like, okay, you break up Live Nation, Ticketmaster, so what? And like maybe this answers some of the so what, right? If you're the only game in town, you get lazy. You get lazy because there's no competition. You get lazy because no one has another option if you want to put on a show like Astroworld. And when you get lazy and when you don't have to work very hard and you're not competing against anyone, not to come out like all pro-capitalist, but in this case, it's very true. Like, things don't matter as much. And then you maybe have more likelihood for this kind of tragedy, right?
Yeah, or that. And also, I'll say is that you get kind of into this, maybe it's kind of feels a little maybe blunt to use this example, but like it feels like you kind of get into the sort of idea first put forth by like Hannah Arendt about like sort of you have this huge bureaucracy and you have like people within it making decisions that like end up that
Sure.
are then there isn't like a checks and balances and there isn't a sense of agency, the sort of desk murderer idea. And there's you're just kind of part of this bigger sort of massive bureaucracy that's like churning along and you don't feel like you have agency to say anything about it. So you're just like signing off on stuff. And like for this, it's like, whatever subsidiary third party, whatever that was hired to put on this concert by Travis Scott, like no one's there. You just, I'm told to just say like, make as much money as possible and cut corners when I can. So like, I'm going to hire these fucking security forces and I'm not going to worry about whether or not they're trained or not because they're fucking security people. They know what's up. I'm moving on, and so like, it's also kind of like, I think that's also how it also could possibly relate, like what you said, but also how it could possibly relate to, the topic of the show today.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. But also, like, even this, like, if you're going to throw another big concert in Houston, who would you organize it through? It would still be Live Nation.
And the thing, and and there's this fucked up thing, and this is also the sort of I guess I don't know, ironic tragedy of this whole thing is that like the actual history of these type of like mass casualty events at like concerts within the last like I don't know 40-50 years is actually like pretty rare.
Extremely
and like
rare.
one of them is like when Pearl Jam decided to kind of go out on their own and try to do shit on their own. And
Yeah, in Europe.
that and so the sort of horrific irony of this all is that like Live Nation are the people that are supposed it's like it's when we talk about major labels, it's like if you really want like really good promotion and you want something that's like really gonna like get pushed out into the world and you want good management because you're like a big artist, actually like the big labels are like really set up for that. And so you would hope that when it comes to putting on a safe, fun, accessible concert, that like the fucking main people in this fucking country that know how to do that, Live Nation, are gonna fucking do it right. And that's the sort of like horrific, because like it's actually, I would rather, at the end of the day, if you asked me, do you want Travis Scott to be in control of like creating his own fucking massive concert, or do you want to bring in Live Nation, which has been doing this for like decades? You would probably be like, yes, I want Live Nation to come in. They'll be the ones to make it safer. And that's the kind of fucking horrific irony of this whole fucking thing. Which like maybe that would help if they got broken up. Maybe it wouldn't. But like yeah, it's
Well,
it's one of those I don't really have a conclusion in the end.
I do thinking about that though, right? Saxon, just at a slightly different level, is also just thinking about like who are Live Nation's competitors right now. And the answer is actually, given the fact that, because when you were describing that, I was thinking about the history of large American companies. I was thinking about Boeing. I was thinking about, General Electric, like these big companies that used to be good at doing things and then got significantly less good at doing things, their traditional outputs over time. They didn't get bad at doing everything because they started doing a new thing, which is being valued on the stock market, right? So you could argue that what is Ticketmaster's competition, or what is Ticketmaster Live Nation's competition? Forget if they're they've got the different businesses. I forget if they're actually like listed on the stock market as Live Nation or Ticketmaster. I think it's Live Nation. Their competition is every other stock out there. So because they're not trying to outdo Ben and Jerry Productions, organic farm fred Vermont concert planning, because they don't have anyone like at that low level. They're competing in terms of profit, in terms of profit margins, in terms of cutting costs against every other company in the world, which creates this kind of lack of fungibility where apples and oranges, where apples are iPhones and oranges are safe concert experiences, are being compared in terms of profit margins. And like, actually, every business is not the same, and every business can't be equally profitable, but many of them can still, make enough money to make a big company run. And so I do wonder if that's at least part of it, and that's one of the potential benefits of some sort of serious antitrust, whether that's breaking up the company or whether that's not nationalizing it, but like the kinds of serious consent decrees that monopolistic companies, if they're decided to be natural monopolies, get sometimes, right, where they have to do certain things. Just that. That's a potential benefit because it means that you have actual apples to apples competition, and you have to actually focus on what you're supposed to be doing instead of, red ink, black ink bullshit.
I think that's probably a good place to wrap this up, but I just want to say that I hate that this is the conclusion we came to, that more competition within a capitalist society will make likely safer concerts for the kids to go to. That's a fucking depressing ass point, but
yeah,
it's the realistic point. It's the most unidealistic point, but I mean that's where we're at. That's where we're at. Well, anyways, I just want to say, like, obviously, like, we this is a difficult subject to talk about. Our hearts, as we said in our last show, like, our hearts and prayers still go out to the families and everything. And yeah, let's hope to never fucking see this again. Let's hope that kids can go to a Travis concert, or as we've seen with the Eras concert this year, just the amount of joy and happiness and like tears of joy that are expressed, emotionally, like at those concerts. And like that's what we want to see. That's what we all want to do when we're at a concert.
We want live music to be safe and affordable.
It seems like a very like simple ask, but yeah, let's hope.
Feels crazy
that,
given our
yeah, and like whatever fucking at that, I'm at a point, and I know it's like not idealistic, and it kind of like maybe is in conflict of like my certain like whatever social political views, but like in the end, it's like anything that causes less suffering and causes this to not happen again, I'm for. If that means like breaking up fucking Live Nation and creating more competition, as our conclusion of this show has come to, fuck it, let's do it. Anyways, music by Bird Language. Thanks for listening. We'll catch y'all. Make sure to like, subscribe to our newsletter, and follow us on all the socials. We'll catch you in a few weeks.